Today, big news in the investigation into the shooting death of 18-year-old Michael Brown. Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson, who shot Brown, has shown his face, coming out of hiding for the first time since August, according to a report. St. Louis Dispatch, citing a single source, reports that Officer Darren Wilson, quote, testified for almost 4 hours Tuesday in front of a St. Louis County grand jury investigating the August 9th shooting of Michael Brown. That comes after a spokesperson for the St. Louis County prosecutor in charge of the investigation, Bob McCullough, told MSNBC that in the name of transparency, McCullough would be releasing the grand jury transcripts and audio if the grand jury did not indict Darren Wilson and if he could get permission. Joining me now to discuss these developments, Lisa Bloom, legal analyst for AVVO.com, also an NBC News legal analyst and author of Suspicion Nation. All right, I have lots of questions, Lisa, about this process.
I've got answers.
Okay, good. That's perfect. So let's start with this report that Darren Wilson testified before the grand jury. I should stress again, this is a single source in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. I don't have any reason to not believe it, but we haven't independently confirmed it. If it is the case that he testified for 4 hours, as the report indicates, how common is that someone who is possibly going to be indicted testifies for that length of time before a grand jury?
It's exceedingly rare because the defendant does not have a right to testify in front of a grand jury. Most of the time, the prosecutors do not want to call them, and most of the time, the defendants themselves don't want to come in and testify because then they give the state a preview of their testimony and they waive their Fifth Amendment rights. You know, Chris, what strikes me here is that every time this prosecutor has had a choice of two different options, he's chosen the one that leans towards the defense. He didn't recuse himself. He didn't file charges against Darren Wilson himself, as he could have. And now he's allowing Darren Wilson to testify in front of the grand jury.
Okay, explain that distinction, because that to me is crucial. When you say he didn't file charges against Darren Wilson himself, as he could have, he is presenting this case before the grand jury. So what do you mean by that?
Because he had a choice. He could have filed charges himself and had a preliminary hearing, which is extremely common. That takes normally about 1 day. You put a couple of police officers on to talk about their investigation. You only have to establish probable cause, and now you're good. And now you have to go ahead and prepare for trial. Instead, he chose a grand jury, which is a very long process. It's now extended to January, and it's completely secretive. And if there is no indictment, he can say, well, don't blame me, blame the grand jurors.
Yeah, and there's also this report. The St. Louis County Prosecutor's Office is taking an unusual approach. Instead of telling grand jury members what charges they believe police officer Darren Wilson should face, they are leaving it open-ended for now and involving the grand jury as co-investigators. What does that mean?
Yes, that's another one. So once again, every choice they make leans towards the defense. Listen, prosecutors have to be concerned about bringing justice. They have kind of a dual role, but they're also normally an advocate for prosecution and an advocate for the victim. I don't see anyone in this grand jury room who is an advocate for Mike Brown, because every time they have a choice, they make a choice that helps the defense.
So normally, let's say in a circumstance where we weren't talking about a police officer shooting, killing someone, but police show up at the scene and a citizen shot and killed someone, that person would be booked and arrested and charged right away, right? There wouldn't be some long grand jury process.
That is correct. And very often it will be, again, by way of a preliminary hearing where the prosecutor examines all of the evidence, decides what the charges would be, and then goes forward with a preliminary hearing. And if it's a grand jury, the prosecutor is an advocate. They don't just throw everything out there and say, hey, citizens, you figure out if there's something here. Those citizens are not attorneys. They're not prosecutors. They're not criminal attorneys. So they don't know what the right charges are. There needs to be an advocate in there explaining to them what they're supposed to be doing.
Lisa Bloom, NBC News legal analyst, thank you so much.
Thank you.
The jury now has until January 7th to make a decision on charges. And it comes as we learn that Michael Brown's killer, Officer Darren Wilson, testified before the grand jury just yesterday. NBC News has not confirmed this, but according to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, Wilson testified for almost 4 hours. So they heard from the shooter. We heard from witnesses. Why would the grand jury be delayed? Why do they need another 16 weeks? Joining me now is Liz Brown, attorney and columnist for the St. Louis American. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me, Reverend.
Liz, Officer Wilson has testified. So why do we have to wait 16 weeks for the grand jury?
We could have asked that 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. We haven't needed the amount of time that has been given to this grand jury to prosecute this case, to seek and find an indictment. There's no reason for this.
I mean, we know who did the shooting. There's no question that the young man is dead. We know the cause of death. We've heard from 7 witnesses publicly saying something. Now they've heard from the policeman. So why do they need to delay the answer or delay their results? 3 months.
Well, there's a political reason for this, and there's a strategical reason for this. There's not a legal reason for this. The political and strategical reason for this is they are trying to test the resolve and to make certain, or to hope that people calm down and the issue becomes another issue. This is all about timing. It's about dragging it out, dragging it into winter, assuming that there will not be the passion, the fury, or any of the actions that will take place if the non-indictment came down today.
But the question becomes, and as you know, when many of us came in and I had the request of the family, our position was not to judge where the evidence goes, but to make sure it's a fair process.
Absolutely.
This smacks as being totally unfair. The federal government needs to come in, because how do you delay something when the obvious is there and you've heard from all sides?
And not only that, Reverend, let's look at what they've allowed to happen. The police officer has testified, according to the Post-Dispatch. Now, why is he testifying? Now, is he testifying first before any of the other witnesses? From all reports, it doesn't appear that any witnesses have been subpoenaed to come in and testify in front of that grand jury. So what does it do if Darren Wilson gets to testify first? He gets to set the tone. All questions then will be attempted to be fit into his narrative. And we also have to understand and make sure that we remember this, that Darren Wilson is the defendant. Darren Wilson is the defendant. What does that mean in this case? It means that the defendant got to write the police report. The defendant got to write that.
And clearly he is not obligated as the suspect, as the defendant, to go in front of the grand jury at all.
He's not, but the only reason that his attorney would have allowed him to go in there and to testify for 4 hours is because it's a friendly environment. It's an environment that is friendly towards police officers. That's not a rap against the grand jury. That's simply what it is. And also, he's been allowed to testify after he's listened to all of the evidence that is going to be put against him. And he's allowed to testify with a blank police report. So it's a perfect environment for this person to go in and testify. And so it's a dream case for the defendant's attorney.
There are no police reports, blank police reports.
That's correct.
He's heard what the witnesses are saying.
That is correct.
And the DA decides what is put in front of the grand jury or not.
Absolutely.
And now the DA announces, and by the way, I'm going to need another 16 weeks. And people wonder why people like me looking in from the outside said, no, the federal government needs to take this so that we will at least know what really is happening, because this just gives people a sense that the process is not fair.
This is neither fair nor impartial, Reverend, clearly.
Well, we're certainly going to be following this, and we're certainly going to be really questioning what is going on with this situation. Liz Brown, thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
One of the things that I think that was clear from the beginning is that we cannot continue to see cases being questioned by local citizens because local prosecutors do things that make people question whether or not they're getting a fair investigation and therefore fair results. We've called on the federal government to step in and take this case. We will continue to do that now. This delay is something troubling. Dr. King used to say, justice delayed, justice denied. Thanks for watching. I'm Al Sharpton.